For 65 years, this church has been in this community to serve and to share the message of salvation through Jesus Christ. The meeting locations have moved over the years, with this little brick church having been completed in the mid-1960s. But to fully understand the history of this church, we need to go back to the beginning. It all started with Dean Overholt, a carpenter from Grand Rapids, and his wife, Almah. Dean had a deep love for God and felt called to the ministry. In 1948, Mrs. Alice Griffin, pastor of the Gaines United Brethren Church, helped Dean with a correspondence course to attain the status of a licensed quarterly conference minister within the UB Church. At that same time, the United Brethren Conference Board had purchased a church building on Whitneyville Road from the Methodist Conference, or so they believed. They sent a young minister to fill the need as pastor, but his lack of patience and his zealousness offended the small existing congregation, and the church doors were closed. Mrs. Griffin, who served on the UB Conference Board, recommended Dean Overholt for the job of rebuilding the congregation. So in 1953, Pastor Dean and his wife Almah accepted the challenge and began holding services in a small church currently known as the Old Time Methodist Church. They asked their grown daughter Marilyn Wilson and her husband Rex to teach the kids Sunday school classes, and were joined by Albert and Clara Rawlings and their children Gloria, Geraldine, Vivian, David, and Ronald. Clara also taught the adult classes. With God's help and the help of these few, the work began. Pastor Dean began calling on families in the area. Two families, the Wisners and the Van Tynens, agreed to send their children if someone would pick them up, and so he did. This brought the congregation on that first Sunday morning on December 3rd, 1953, to 16 in all. Pastor Dean continued to work in the community and called on the Bowser family, who had recently moved from Pennsylvania. Joyce, Joanne, and Andy Bowser, along with their married daughter, Gay, and her husband, Bob Walter, joined the congregation. The small church family was growing. Pastor began bringing his two grandchildren, Jimmy and Barbie Buxton, known today as Jim Grundyke Sr. and Barb Huizinga. Pat Biggs and her two brothers, Harold and Larry, joined, and the Simmons children, Carl, Ruth, and Phil, along with the Edwin Dowse family, joined. Since the little white church building on Whitneyville had been vacant for a while, the small congregation all worked together to clean up the churchyard, cutting brush and mowing grass. One fond memory was the hot dog and marshmallow roast they had when they were done, singing choruses led by Pat Biggs on guitar and just having fun. Does that sound familiar to anyone who attended our hot dog roast a few weeks back? At some point, Jimmy and Barbie's parents, Catherine and John Grundyke, began attending. Catherine was a major influence as a teacher and organizer, and her husband, John, made sure that any repair on the church was efficiently taken care of. Others in the church would provide special music for services, often when Pastor Dean would just call out names and ask them to come forward and pick out a song to sing. The church continued to grow, with congregation members inviting their friends, and those friends inviting yet other friends. During this first year, tragedy struck the Simmons family when their home burned down. Thankfully, no one was hurt, and when they began rebuilding their home, Pastor Dean and some of the young men of the church helped roof the new house. This is the house next door to the south of today's church building. Around 1954, the UB Conference found that the bishop of the Methodist Conference had passed away. He was the person who had agreed to sell the church building to the United Brethren. However, there apparently was no proper paperwork as proof, so the purchase fell through, and the building reverted back to the Methodist Conference. Pastor Baylord of the Old Time Methodist congregation was holding services in a storefront about a mile away on McCord's Avenue and needed a church building, so the Methodist Conference sold it to them. This left the Whitneyville congregation without a meeting place. The church family was very close by this time, and some of the younger people told Pastor Dean that they would not go to another church, so something had to be done. There was property next to the Simmons home on Whitneyville that was owned by Mr. Pyard. He was willing to sell a narrow strip of land for $500. After prayerfully considering the situation, Pastor Dean and his wife Almah decided to borrow the money from Fidelity Loan Company on behalf of the congregation to purchase the land for a new church. Mr. and Mrs. Simmons generously offered the use of their basement in their newly rebuilt home for a church meeting place while funds were being gathered to build the church building. A 5-octave piano that belonged to Almah Overholt was able to be moved to the basement of the home, and the church purchased folding chairs, with Ed Dowse using his Steelcase employee discount. These same chairs are still used in the fellowship hall today. Carol Simmons invited her friends Joanna Visser to come to Sunday school. She brought her sisters Nellie, Alice, and Marion, and their brothers. The girls would share their gift of singing often with the congregation. Joanna and Nellie sang a duet, Silent Night, for the first Christmas program, which was directed by Catherine Grundyke. During this time, there were many projects to raise funds for the new church building. There were car washes, rummage sales, paper drives. There was a mile of pennies and a peach festival in the parking lot behind the Earl Robson department store at Home Acres. The Caledonia United Brethren congregation also helped by hosting a monthly hymn sing and contributing the offerings to the building. Each fundraiser was for a specific purpose, for a furnace, floor tile, whatever was needed. Orlo Good of the UB congregation made a beautiful inlaid wooden cross which was placed on the piano. This cross is still being used today and can be found on the entryway table. He also made matching candlestick holders and gave them to Mrs. Griffin, but she felt the set belonged together, so she generously gave them to the Whitneyville congregation as well. By 1960, the church basement was finished and the congregation was able to hold services in their new church. The basement entry was under where the piano is located today, and a platform was built on the opposite side of the church basement as the stage. If you ever wondered why the craft room door doesn't go all the way to the floor, this is why. It had to clear the stage floor, which remained there until the basement carpeting was replaced 9 years ago. The basement ceiling was originally covered with aluminum foil to hide the insulation. It rattled every time the door was opened, so no one could sneak into church late. This picture of Jesus was hung in the front of the basement sanctuary as a lovely reminder of his presence. This same year, the first wedding was held in the new church basement. Joanna Visser was marrying Richard Ford, so the congregation rushed around to tile the aluminum ceiling and hang nicer drapes for the very special occasion. The positioning of the church building had been decided by Pastor Dean and Mrs. Griffin. However, when a survey was taken, it was determined that the building was too close to the neighbor's property line. By this time, the Simmons had moved, and the home was owned by Claire and Betty Hayner. They were wonderful neighbors and didn't want to make trouble for the church, so they agreed to let the group scrape and paint their house in return for the required footage to make it legal. This is why the survey shows an odd shape to the property. Pat Biggs and Don Pitt, who began attending in the early days of the church, got married. Both were talented singers and guitar players and often supplied the music. They became evangelists, traveling the country full-time, spreading the message of salvation. Pastor Dean was impressed by churches that held outdoor drive-in services on Sunday evenings. So the church bought speakers for the front yard of the church where people would sit in their cars listening to the service. Okay, maybe not quite this many cars, but I do hear they drew quite a good crowd to hear God's message, with neighbors even sitting in lawn chairs in their backyards to listen to the service. The piano was downstairs, and the singers were on the flat roof of the finished basement. It was tricky, but they made it work. It's inspiring to see what the dedication and faith of a few people can do to spread the word of Christ around a community and grow the congregation. In 1961, Dean and Lois Favreau moved into the community, and Lois started attending with her daughter Sherry, age 3. Her family would grow to include Amy, Darcy, and Buddy. Lois still attends services faithfully today. In 1964, the construction began on the church building, with Dean and Almah Overholt, the signers, on a loan for $11,600 from Old Kent Bank. Since Dean, being a carpenter, was building much of it himself, the Cascade Township officials granted more than the allotted time to get the building finished. The material was purchased from Anderson Lumber Company, and Mr. Anderson even built a pulpit for the congregation as a gift. It replaced the one the UB conference had donated when the church first started, and has since been replaced by the pulpit you see today, which was made by Jim Grundyke Jr. for his dad 22 years ago, when Jim Sr. was pastoring the church. To finish the lawn, John Grundyke and Don McDermott headed up a project to rent a sod cutter. Everyone helped haul sod from the Wilsons' backyard 16 miles to the church. Several singing groups were created over the years. The first choir made robes out of turquoise material and used men's white handkerchiefs as ties. Later, these blue robes were purchased for the choir, who would accompany the congregation through the first half of the service and share a special song each Sunday. Ross Dowse and his wife Sandy, her sister Joanne Atchison, and Fred and Lynn Wilson had a singing group called The Gospel Way. They shared the gospel in 4-part harmony, accompanied by rhythm guitar, bass, tambourine, and piano, here at Whitneyville, as well as other churches. A group of Dean's children and grandchildren, called the Descendants, shared their singing talents with the congregation. The group was made up of Dean's daughters, Catherine and Marilyn, and his grandkids, Barb and Jack Heisinga, Joan and Don Van Otteren, Jim Grundyke, and Fred Wilson. The young kids were also assembled into a junior choir called God's New Generation. Orange vests were made to wear over white shirts, giving them a professional look. The group sang at occasional Sunday services, being led by Joan and accompanied on the piano by Lynn. And of course, there was the hymn tones, made up of sisters Joanna, Nellie, and Alice Visser. These ladies would share their singing talent for years in trios, duets, and solos. Joanna still sings frequently at this church. Nancy Delkey was another of the faithful choir members and often came up with very special additions to the service. She was originally invited by her daughter Deb, who had started attending the young people's class. Nancy had many kids and grandkids and now great-grandkids who attended, and many were active in Sunday school and Bible school events along with her. Pastor Dean bought a used Jeep and delighted in going around after a heavy snow to plow out driveways and parking lots for free. He kept the church lot cleaned out and also the lots for the Gaines, Caledonia, and Dutton United Brethren churches. When these 3 churches combined into one at the Gaines Church, the Dutton congregation donated their organ in appreciation for Pastor Dean's thoughtfulness. That was our very first organ. Hilda Slaughter served as organist for years and played with such zest that they needed to put a block of wood under the pedal to limit the volume so they could hear themselves sing. She was a wonderful, dynamic woman. That original organ fell into disrepair until 2003 when Doris Roselle donated her organ to the church, and this is the organ we have today. The church legally belonged to Dean and Almah Overholt because the loan was in their names. In a church meeting, the congregation agreed to deed the building over to the United Brethren Conference, with the stipulation that there would never be a kitchen in the church, based on teachings in Matthew and 1 Corinthians. The UB Conference board members felt that would set an undesirable precedent, and so the gift of the church was refused. During this time, Pastor Dean's health was failing, and since the church wasn't going to be transferred to the UB Conference, it needed to be deeded to the congregation. But this required the congregation become an independent church. The notice of this was a letter of separation dated January 2, 1973, and signed by 23 congregation members. On January 29, the church filed to become incorporated as Whitneyville Church of Jesus Christ, and Dean and Almah signed the property over to the congregation. Mrs. Griffin helped the church board prepare a doctrine and constitution, which stands largely unchanged to this day. Shortly after, Pastor Dean became paralyzed from cancer and carried on faithfully from his wheelchair as long as he could. Lay minister Ed Dowse, along with Brian Shook, a young preacher from Lowell, helped keep services going during this time. The congregation had succeeded in paying off the mortgage in 1973 and had a mortgage burning party at Catherine and John Grundyke's. Dean and Almah were able to do the honors, ceremoniously burning a copy of the paperwork. Richard Ford, Joanna's husband, became co-minister with Dean's grandson, Jim Grundyke Sr. The two alternated on morning and evening services until Richard left and Jim took over pastoring, serving 30 years with his wife Judy, until his death in 2005. He was known for using a few stories over and over, including the story where he thought he needed to buy a fire truck because he had gotten a hose stuck in the ground trying to blow out a well, and the story of slipping on the ice in downtown Cedar Springs and sliding fully under the parked car as townspeople looked on in disbelief. This and many stories made it into sermons on a regular basis. Let's listen back 16 years to a few words about stepping out in faith, recorded by Pastor Jim in 2002.
What did Ananias say to him? He says, "You are a chosen vessel of mine to spread the gospel to the Gentiles, and to the Greeks, and to the Jews." You are a chosen vessel of mine. And he could have said, "Not me." He could have said, "No, that's not what I'm going to do." But the Spirit convicted him. The Spirit convinced him. And he says, "Okay, I'll do it."
Following Jim's death in 2005, and after a year-long search, Pastor Don and Sue Crawford joined our congregation. Don was just finishing his studies to be ordained, having received the calling later in life. Don led the church for 10 years before retiring. Don and Sue were followed by Pastor Ed Carpenter and his wife Jackie from Grand Rapids, who have been serving since March 2017. The new church needed additional decorating, so another of Pastor Dean's granddaughters, Barb Heisinga, painted pictures for rooms in the church. These included Jesus the Good Shepherd, which was located in the back of the sanctuary until just a few years ago, as well as pictures in the downstairs classrooms of Moses and the bulrushes, Joseph and the coat of many colors, Noah's Ark, David and Goliath, and Jesus' baptism. After the service, feel free to revisit the basement and see how things have changed, and yet stayed the same over the years. In later years, crocheted panels were made by Joanna Kilgore to cover the backs of the piano and organ. One hangs at the back of the church today. Pews were bought in 1979 to replace the folding chairs. Many of you will remember the bright orange upholstery that was used, which was a popular color in the 1970s. The blue carpet also had flecks of orange, and the basement had rust shag carpet throughout. Many Easter programs were performed over the years, often led by Dean's daughters and granddaughters. The ladies made a whole closet full of costumes over the years, including kings and shepherds, Mary and Joseph, and angels and stars. Then there was a toy soldier and ornaments, and even kimonos. And what would a manger scene be without the cows? Special music has always been a big part of this church, with songs praising God and words touching people's hearts. I personally always needed to avoid eye contact with Nellie and certain other people when I was singing. Otherwise, I'd choke up and couldn't finish the song because they were so moved by the precious words of Jesus' love. Youth have been a big part of the church history, with many of the current members having attended since they were kids. Betty Venton helped with the missionary group, while her son, Ed, supported the young people's group in the early years. Later, the teens would be led by Lynn and Fred Wilson, who took them on weekend outings, including backpacking on Manitoulin Island and the Allegan State Game area. Lynn Wilson and her mom, Marilyn, would later organize a 15-mile bike ride on the Cal Haven Trail, ending at the beach in South Haven. Thankfully, there was an ice cream stop at the halfway point to re-energize the bikers and clean Lindsay's wounded elbow. Joan Van Otteren would lead the youth group in the 1990s, holding Bible study every Wednesday evening with a group of teens from the congregation and many of their friends. She taught them about Christ and how to live a life pleasing to Him. Nancy Koning and I followed her with the next group of teens, holding some services outdoors, accompanied by Justin Koning. Pickup service was provided for those needing transportation. And I continued with the last group of teens, planning outings such as this downtown scavenger hunt with the help of Lynn Wilson. The teens had to find various architectural building elements matching to provided pictures and take their own picture as proof, racing to the final meeting place. Years later included trips to the Caboose ice cream station, holding Bible study at their picnic tables. Youth groups continued until the last teen, Ashley Bitely, graduated. Many different types of outreach have taken place through the years. Vacation Bible School was a large endeavor, requiring many volunteers. The largest year hosted 83 kids from the church and community, teaching about God's love for them and the importance of asking Jesus into your heart. Themes have ranged over the years from fruits of the Spirit, fish, carnival, and even racing, complete with a real race car, thanks to Taylor Albert's dad, Dave Sensiba. Revival services were held each year with guest ministers invited to preach. In 1963, the revival meetings ran for 6 weeks with services every evening. Pat and Vince Geluso joined those meetings. Pastor Dean's nephew, Ray Overholt, and his wife Millie became evangelists and served many years, with both of them sharing their music and testimony, and Ray preaching. Even after Ray lost his sight and then became wheelchair-bound, they continued to share their ministry. I remember Ray, after he went blind, reciting the first chapter of John and impressing on us how important it is to read and learn your Bible, because you never know when you'll lose that ability and have to draw on your memory. Ray and Millie wrote many songs over the years, with the most memorable being 10,000 Angels. Marilyn Wilson and Betty Venton had a desire to help fill the needs of others. To accomplish this, they formed the church's missionary group, which would collect money and volunteer time to help others. In the beginning, members brought fruit to make fruit baskets to give to people who were sick. For years, holiday favors were brought to residents of the Cascade Care Nursing Home. The group has helped with heat bills, house payments, pharmacy bills, car repairs, and groceries. Support is provided to missionaries Tim and Christy Holliday and their family, with Tim having been originally from Caledonia. They are currently serving at the Texas-Mexico border, where they use their gifts to serve those in need and see God's kingdom grow. Donations are also made to several local charities, all of which help those in need and deliver the message of Jesus Christ. Bob and Gay Walter started an annual program to supply coats, hats, and gloves to children at the Stocking Elementary School. When they would pick up their grandchildren at the school, they often saw many small children without warm clothes, and they wanted to help. This tradition of giving continued every fall for many years until the father of one of the children, who had previously received a new coat, had become financially able to take on the project himself. The youth group sponsored a child for many years after attending a concert at Kentwood Community Church that was sponsored by World Vision. They selected Kealili Kumalo from Swaziland and nicknamed him Kyle because they couldn't say his real name. They agreed to bring offerings each Wednesday to help support him, and they also wrote letters to him occasionally. They continued to support him until he left the program. After him was Saul Perez Papa from the Dominican Republic, who was supported by the next group of teens, Lindsay, Bailey, Morgan, and Ashley. The missionary group also sponsors a child each year through Christian Children's Fund. The largest compassion project for the group was to purchase a house in Grand Rapids from Dean and Lois Favreau's daughter and son-in-law, Amy and Ken Lance, for $19,000. Ken had become a pastor of a church in Ohio, and so their house was for sale. The congregation donated money and held fundraisers for the project, named the Dorchester House. The house was then donated to the Servants Center in Grand Rapids, an organization started by Don Tack and his wife to help inner-city poor and homeless. The house was renovated and provided to Dorchester House Ministries for outreach to the predominantly Hispanic Black Hills neighborhood in Grand Rapids' inner city. That group has since combined with other local ministries in the area to form United in Christ Ministries. It is wonderful to see how a seed can grow when put in God's hands. The missionary group currently has a prison ministry which has run for years. Lois Favreau and Marilyn Wilson, and then Joan Van Otteren, began visiting with prisoners occasionally and mailing the Sikh Sunday school papers to them. Lois and her daughter Darcy continue the visitations today, and Joanna handles mailing the papers to prisoners. It is just another avenue to share the message of Jesus Christ to those who are lost. Another group, the Ladies' Circle, was formed to plan and raise money for various church events. The group was dubbed the Silly Circle because the evening usually ended in a fit of giggles. The ladies would meet one Tuesday each month to plan events such as Bible school, the Sunday school picnic, and a charity bazaar at Eastbrook Mall. The church congregation enjoyed getting together for social times as well and had many zany parties. Whether they were playing musical chairs, cooking up something to eat, working as a team to win a game, or playing pin the tail on the pastor, there was always love and laughter. Events were typically hosted at someone's house, such as this cowboy-themed party, which was a progressive party at various members' houses, including the Konings and Heisingas. Cowboy hats, line dancing, and a hearty ranch meal made for a great night. Plus, as always, there was laughter, such as Katie Koning entertaining the crowd.
Go. You want that last part where it sneezes.
The Sunday school picnic was always an anticipated event taking place at Dutton Shadyside Park for many years. There would be great food and kids' games, followed by a softball game, and there was always a water fight of some sort, either water balloons or soaker guns, or just a bucket of water over the head. Thank you, Kim, for initiation my first year at this church. The day would wrap up with afternoon singing and a sermon. It was clear that the congregation was a tight-knit family and enjoyed serving together as brothers and sisters in Christ. There were many special services where members demonstrated a heart for Christ and a commitment to live for Him. Baptismal services in particular were very special for the church. In the early years, people were baptized at Hilton Park on Green Lake. The Hiltons were friends and would close the park a little early so the church could use the beach and bathhouse. Being out in nature and feeling the wonders of God made them feel even closer to Him. One fall, Dolores Allred felt a strong need to be baptized, but the park was closed for the season, so the church gathered at the boat launch for the service. Baptisms were also performed at Campbell Lake and more recently in the Thornapple River, not far from the church. In 2002, when Shannon Lindsay and Jerry Grundyke, Jerry Amelia, Katie Koning, and Lori Zilmer were all baptized, the river had been busy with boat traffic, and there was concern of being able to hear Pastor Jim. But as the congregation sang and Pastor entered the water, it got really quiet and stayed that way throughout the entire service. During the baptism, 2 white swans swam back and forth on the other side of the river, as if to oversee the proceedings. It was a very moving evening watching this large group show outwardly their commitment of living a life for Christ. More recently, Pastor Don Crawford baptized Justin Koning. Justin's dad, Bob, joined him in the river to assist with the baptism. And in 2016, Ashley Ford, Joanna's granddaughter-in-law, requested to be baptized, and once again, we gathered at the river. Infant and child dedications were performed for parents who wanted to publicly commit to raising their children according to Jesus' teachings. Catherine Grundyke and later Barb Heisinga would make felt banners to be presented to the parents in honor of the dedication. And of course, there were weddings. Joanna Ford may have been the first wedding, but certainly wasn't the last, with many being married in the church over the years. A few examples are Jim and Judy Grundyke, married in 1965. A year later, Barb and Jack Heisinga, married in 1966. And then in 1986, Jim and I were married in this sanctuary. Most recently, Shannon and Chris Trumley were married by Don Crawford in Fallsburg Park, Lowell. And in December will be yet another wedding celebration in this sanctuary as Lindsay Grundyke marries Mark Stoll. The turn of the century was a decade for caring for the Lord's house and grounds. In 2000, it was decided that the young kids needed a play set to enjoy after church where they could run off a little energy. Barb and Jack headed the search process and installation of the play structure, and Ashley Bitely was the first to cut the ribbon and start playing. In 2002, after 29 years as Whitneyville Church of Jesus Christ, the congregation voted to change the name to Whitneyville Fellowship Church. The goal was to better identify as an independent church and avoid confusion with another denomination that used naming similar to the original one. A new sign was ordered in plum lettering, with this color eventually being repeated on the church doors for a fresh look. The circle drive was removed in 2003 because it was too dangerous to pull out of that drive. Plus, buses and semis kept using the drive and were killing the bushes and other landscaping. So we rented a cutting saw and a front end loader and removed the pavement. then put down topsoil and seeded back to grass. Jim Grundyke Jr. built a bench to put at the end of the turnaround so cars wouldn't continue across the new grass. The church carpeting was eventually replaced a little at a time, with the first step being the remodel of the church entryway. A ramp was needed inside the church to provide access to both the sanctuary and bathrooms. A portable ramp had been utilized when needed, but in 2008, Don and Joan Bonadaran spearheaded a project to remove the existing bathrooms as well as the old cry room that had been converted into a coat closet. The bathrooms were repositioned and doorways widened to allow wheelchair access. The cry room was removed and a ramped hallway installed, and the remaining space made into a coat nook. Once complete, new carpeting was installed in the entryway. Then in 2010, the front approach to the church was reworked, adding a handicapped ramp and railings to make it easier to enter the church, along with landscaping to make it aesthetically pleasing. In 2009, the basement classroom carpeting was replaced, and then the sanctuary carpeting in 2012. The sanctuary was quite the project, with nearly the entire congregation plus a few friends coming together to move the pews, pull up the old carpeting, and remove all the old tiles from the original floor. Those who couldn't do the heavy lifting kept the floor swept of debris so the others could continue to work, or were on breakfast and lunch duty to make sure everyone kept up their energy. It was an all-day project, even with all the help, but it cut down the cost considerably and allowed Weston's Carpets from Middleville to install carpeting in the sanctuary, office, and pastor's study in just 2 days. Then in 2014, the pews were recovered with green you see today, replacing the original bright orange upholstery. Much of the church improvement work during this time was accomplished through member donations of both time and money. Through this care of the Lord's house and grounds, the congregation worked to ensure that this house would remain ever open and welcoming to those wishing to worship our Lord and King. Since the start of the church, gatherings needed to be held outside or in people's houses. There was growing interest in building a fellowship hall on the land behind the church, and Marilyn Wilson and Joanna Kilgore were the head cheerleaders. After prayerful consideration, the board decided to begin raising money toward the building, and if sufficient funds were not raised, then it would be determined that the project was not in God's will. Various fundraising events were held, including a taco dinner at Heisinga's and several years of house sitting for the Parade of Homes. Pop cans were collected, and a soup and salad supper was hosted by the Lady Circle. Probably the largest event was running a food booth for the Cascade July 4th celebration. We served pulled pork barbecue sandwiches, heated and assembled by volunteers, as well as pizza delivered from a local restaurant. It took a crew to keep things running smoothly and serve the crowds of customers. By May 2004, sufficient funds had been raised to build the main hall. A groundbreaking ceremony was held with many of the longtime leaders manning shovels and digging the first holes in the sod. Cutler Builders led the project, with construction continuing through the summer. By September 2004, their part of the construction was complete, and the congregation was able to take over the rest of the work. After Sunday service one week, we held a special graffiti day, where everyone left messages in marker on the framing. If you were to climb into the attic today, you would still see messages left by teen boys Justin Koning and Chad Nofke in the rafters. Most messages had the same theme, that the building be a blessing to God and always be used for His glory. Aunt Marilyn's message is in the kitchen pass-through window behind the trim, and I think of it often when hosting events in the building. May this building always be used for your glory. Thank you, God. Work needed to be done outside the hall before winter set in. The congregation worked to create a pea gravel drive and completed the landscaping around the building. To repeat an oft-said quote of Marilyn's, "Many hands make light work." Then it was time for wiring. Kim helped drill holes through all of the 2x4s so electrical wires could be run. The team helped to install drywall throughout the building. Then was time for priming, painting, and varnishing. Thanks to a couple of snow days, the kids were able to put in extra time and were a big help. The crew gathered to help finish the trim so it could be installed around windows and doors. While it was exhausting work, it was also very fulfilling to give of time, talents, and money toward a house that could be used to bless the Lord. By April 2005, the hall was complete enough to host an open house. The kitchen was still an empty room, so congregation members set up makeshift countertops and a sink so we were functional. Barb Huizinga donated a new refrigerator so we had a place to store the food and made curtains to cover the under-counter storage. The open house was well attended by friends and family, as well as the various contractors who had worked on the building. Sadly, Marilyn Wilson had passed before the hall was finished, but her memory lives on through her vision and dedication to God's work. In memory of Marilyn, her daughter Lynn donated the Fellowship Hall acoustical wall panels, greatly improving the sound quality in the hall. There have been many other items donated to the church over the years in remembrance of loved ones. An early donation was the communion table given by Gloria and Bernie Sanders in memory of their 2-year-old son, Jimmy Joe. A cross-stitch account of the church's beginning was made by Beth Lampagne in memory of her grandparents, Pastor Dean and Almah Overholt. Clergy pews were donated in memory of Buddy Grimm, who lived to an age of 102. Bob Walter created 2 beautiful candelabras with a matching unity candle that was used for his daughter Beth's wedding in the early 80s. When she passed several years later, Bob and Gay donated an attendance record board in her memory. Later, he made 3 wooden crosses for the wall behind the pulpit. A framed picture of Jerusalem was hung in the classroom upstairs in memory of Catherine Grundyke, who faithfully taught the adult class for so many years. A trio of pine trees stand on the south side of the church, planted in memory of Rex Wilson. They've grown a bit bigger than when they were first planted. The primary Sunday school classes received a TV and VCR in memory of Don and Thelma McDermott, and monetary donations in memory of Jim Grundyke Sr. went towards completion of the Fellowship Hall kitchen. Money for new hymnals were donated in memory of Lou and June Papp, and a nursery room speaker was purchased in memory of Nancy Koning. Today's church congregation continues to reach out to the community in various ways. Outreach events are hosted throughout the year, inviting the community to attend. Christian movie nights have been hosted, showing films such as Fireproof, God's Not Dead, and Facing the Giants. We have held food distribution events for community members in need. There have been game nights, chili cook-offs, soup suppers, Easter egg hunts, harvest celebrations, and a fire safety day with a real fire truck from Cascade Fire Department that the kids could check out. A church website was created several years ago by Jim Grundyke Jr. and is updated regularly to provide information about the church as well as weekly recordings of the sermon. In addition, a Facebook site was created by Andre Jansen to provide event information, sermon recordings, inspirational messages, and pictures of events that can be shared with others. Many people attended over the years and are too numerous to mention. But one thing everyone had in common: they loved the Lord, They loved the church, and they loved each other. Everyone could be counted on to help when needed. Many wonderful ministry events were held, which aren't included in this account, but all were done for the glory of the Lord. The ways of ministry and outreach have taken on different shapes throughout the years, but all were intended to share the love of God and the message of Christ's salvation to the world. We are here to be a light to the world and to lead the lost to salvation through Jesus Christ. May these doors remain always open and God's work always be done. Thank you.
Tis the gift to be simple, tis the gift to be free, tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. When we find ourselves in a place just right, it will be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come out right. Tis the gift to be gentle, tis the gift to be fair, tis the gift to wake and feel the morning air. Every day to walk in the path we choose, it's the gift that we pray we may ne'er come to lose. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come out right. Tis the gift to be loving, tis the best gift of all. Like a quiet rain, it blesses where it falls. If we have the gift, we will truly believe it's better to give than it is to receive. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will my prayer and deepest longing, to be pure without within. Oh, I want to be like Jesus, cleansed from dross and free from self and sin. Oh, I want to talk like Jesus. Gracious are the words from him we hear, words of life and hope for sinners, tender healing words of love and cheer. Oh, the power and the value of a fitly spoken word. Oh, I want to talk like Jesus, anytime or place my voice is heard. Oh, I want to serve like Jesus. Willingly he came from heaven above. On the earth he lived for others, spent his life in kindly deeds of love. I will follow where he leads me, and his bidding always do. Oh, I want to be like Jesus, till my traveling days